It happened before the door closed, before the engines reached full voice, at the exact moment when people still believed they could look away. A man in a gray suit stood up in the aisle and blocked row 14 with his body, gripping the seat back like it belonged to him. He didn't lower his voice. "I'm not flying next to him," he said, tapping his ticket. "You can move me or you can move him. I don't care how you fix it." The stewardess froze, her practiced smile cracking under pressure. Around them, boarding stopped. Bags hung half open. Heads turned. Martin Luther King Jr. was already seated by the window, coat folded, a thin folder on his lap, calm as if he had been expecting the moment rather than stumbling into it. The man hadn't recognized him, or worse, didn't care. "This is ridiculous," the man continued. "I paid for this seat. I'm not spending 2 hours pressed against this." He leaned closer, letting the word rot in the air. "You people are getting bold." A woman behind them whispered something like a prayer. Someone else stared too long. No one intervened. "Sir," the stewardess said carefully, "please take your seat so we can—" "No," he snapped. "I'll stand. Let them throw me off if they want, but I'm not sitting next to him." Now it wasn't a complaint. It was a performance, a declaration of power made loud enough to recruit silence. Martin kept looking out the window at the runway lights fading into dusk. Only when the stewardess's voice began to tremble did he turn his head. "Sir," Martin said gently, "what is it you believe you're protecting yourself from?" The question unsettled the aisle. It wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It was curiosity. Clean, steady. "Don't play smart," the man hissed. "You know exactly what I mean." "I know what you're saying," Martin replied, "but what you believe is steering you more than this plane ever will." A soldier a few rows back straightened. A teenage boy leaned out for a better view. The stewardess reached toward the intercom. "Involve whoever you want," the man barked, spreading his arms. "Let them see what kind of experiment you're running back here." That word landed wrong. It turned a seat into a verdict. Martin unbuckled and stood, filling the narrow space without threatening it. Not taller, steadier. "You wanted a scene," he said quietly. "Be careful. Scenes show more than you intend." The man scoffed, then suddenly reached down and yanked Martin's boarding pass from the seat pocket, holding it up between two fingers. "See?" he announced to the cabin. "Anybody can sit anywhere now." A gasp. The stewardess moved fast. "Sir, give that back." He shoved her hand aside. Not enough to knock her down. Enough to cross a line. Martin looked at the stewardess first. A silent assurance. Then he turned back, voice clear as glass. "You've mistaken comfort for authority," he said. The man laughed, thin now. "I've got plenty of authority." "Then return what you took," Martin said, holding out his hand. For a second, the cabin stopped breathing. The door closed with a heavy final sound behind them, sealing 83 witnesses inside a plane that hadn't taken off yet and already couldn't turn back. "No," the man said. "Make me." The engines deepened into a steady hum, vibrating through the floor, and the truth settled in with it. The plane was moving, and this argument had nowhere to go. The man in the gray suit still held himself stiffly in the aisle, confidence no longer loud but tight, defensive. "Sit down," he said to Martin, trying to make it sound like authority. "You're making a spectacle." Martin kept his hand extended, palm open, calm enough to feel disruptive. Around them, the cabin reorganized itself in silence. Some passengers leaned away, others leaned in, all of them trapped inside the same metal decision. "Sir," the stewardess said, her voice now stripped of training, "we are taxiing. You must return that ticket and take your seat." "Rules," the man muttered, forcing a laugh. "Finally." "Rules exist to protect people," Martin replied evenly, "not to rank them." The man looked around for allies and found only avoidance. A businessman ahead cleared his throat. "Just give it back," he said, not brave but no longer silent. "Stay out of it," the man snapped. "It concerns everyone," Martin said. "When humiliation becomes public, it belongs to the room." The plane turned slightly. Bodies shifted. No exits. With a sharp motion, the man slapped the boarding pass back into Martin's hand. "There. Happy now?" Martin folded it carefully and sat, not in submission, but by choice. The stewardess exhaled and moved away. People pretended to return to magazines and belts they wouldn't use. The tension didn't leave. The man leaned away in his seat, jaw clenched. "This country's changing too fast," he muttered. "People forgetting their place." "No one forgets their place," Martin said. "They remember their worth." The words hit harder than volume. A woman covered her mouth. Someone whispered. "You think you're better than me?" The man snapped. "No," Martin answered. "I think you are better than this." The captain announced takeoff. The runway stretched ahead. Silence gathered like pressure. The man leaned closer and said it, the sentence that wouldn't survive the flight. "You don't belong up here." Martin closed his eyes briefly, not in defeat, in preparation. The plane lifted with a long, deliberate pull, the kind that pressed silence into the chest before it released it. And as the ground fell away, the sentence stayed behind, hanging in the cabin like smoke that hadn't decided where to go. "You don't belong up here." Martin opened his eyes as the wheels tucked in, not startled, not offended in the way the man expected, but attentive, as if he had just been handed something fragile that required care. He waited until the seatbelt light chimed and the initial roar softened into a steady rush, until motion became normal again and fear tried to disguise itself as routine. "You're wrong," Martin said, quietly enough that the words didn't challenge the cabin, only the man beside him. "I belong anywhere my humanity allows me to sit." The man scoffed and turned toward the aisle, shoulders squared, jaw tight, performing indifference. "Spare me the sermon," he muttered. "This isn't a church." "That is true," Martin replied, "but people reveal their beliefs more honestly outside of churches." A ripple moved through the rows. Not applause, not agreement. Attention. The kind that comes when people realize the moment has not passed, that it has merely changed shape. The stewardess passed once, slower than necessary, eyes flicking toward row 14, and then away, like someone checking a wound she hoped was no longer bleeding. The man leaned forward, elbows on knees, speaking toward the floor now. "You think you're teaching me something," he said, "but I grew up knowing how the world works. There's order. There's hierarchy. You start pretending otherwise, everything falls apart." "Order without justice," Martin said, "is just cruelty wearing a uniform." The man laughed, sharp and short. "Easy for you to say from a seat like this." Martin nodded, as if conceding a point that wasn't actually there. "It is never easy to speak where you are tolerated only on condition of silence." Across the aisle, a young woman twisted her wedding ring. A soldier stared at the seat back in front of him as if it were a test he hadn't studied for. Somewhere behind them, a man whispered, "He's right," and immediately wished he hadn't. The plane leveled off. The cabin lights shifted. Normality tried again. The man turned back at last, unable to leave it alone. "What do you want?" he asked. "An apology? You want me to feel bad?" "I want you to see," Martin answered. "Because once you see clearly, feeling follows whether you invite it or not." The man's face hardened. "I see plenty." "No," Martin said gently. "You see what you were taught not to question?" The words didn't accuse. They exposed. And exposure made the man restless. He shifted, adjusted his jacket, looked down the aisle for interruption, for rescue, for someone to end this with authority. Instead, a voice came from 2 rows back. Older. Careful. "Let the man speak," it said, surprising even itself. The man spun around. "You too." The voice didn't answer. It didn't need to. It had already crossed the only line that mattered. Martin inhaled, deep and slow, and for the first time since boarding, he turned his body fully toward the cabin, not standing, not announcing himself, but aligning his presence with the space, as if the conversation had grown larger than 2 seats. "I will say this once," he said, calm enough to steady the air. "Every system that asks a man to accept humiliation in exchange for peace is already preparing its own collapse." The engines droned. The sky outside was clean and indifferent. The man swallowed, his certainty thinning, replaced by something closer to fear. Not of Martin, but of what it meant to be seen saying what he had said, at this height, with nowhere left to hide. And for the first time since the gate, he did not speak back. The silence belonged to Martin now. Silence at cruising altitude is never truly silent. It hums. It presses, it waits. And now it waited on the man in the gray suit, who had built his life on being the loudest voice in every room and found himself disarmed by a calm he couldn't interrupt. He shifted again, clearing his throat as if sound itself might restore balance. "You talk like this is philosophy," he said at last, voice low, almost careful. "But this is real life. People sit where they belong. That's how things work." Martin didn't rush to answer. He let the delay do its work. Let the cabin feel the space where certainty used to be. "Real life," Martin said, "is made of moments like this. And in moments like this, people decide whether they will defend comfort or dignity." The stewardess stopped near their row, pretending to check a latch, listening without turning her head. Two businessmen across the aisle exchanged a glance they hadn't meant to share. A woman further back nodded once, small and involuntary. The man scoffed again, but the sound lacked teeth. "You make it sound heroic," he said. "Sitting in a seat, flying on a plane." "It isn't heroic," Martin replied. "It's ordinary. That's why the resistance to it is so revealing." The man leaned back, folding his arms, retreating into posture when words failed him. "You want me to admit I'm wrong," he said. "That's what this is." "I want you to ask why you needed to be right so badly," Martin answered. That landed harder than accusation. The man's eyes flicked toward the windows, toward the endless blue that didn't care about his money, his name, his rules. For a brief moment, he looked smaller, less certain of the boundaries that had always obeyed him. A voice cut in from the aisle seat behind them. "He didn't start this," the soldier said finally, measured but firm. "You did." The man turned, startled. "Mind your business." "It became everyone's business when you made it public," the soldier replied. A murmur followed. Not agreement exactly. Permission. The quiet permission of witnesses realizing they were allowed to speak. Martin raised a hand slightly, not to silence them, but to keep the moment from breaking apart. "This is not a trial," he said. "It's a mirror." The man swallowed. His confidence, once built on noise, now had nowhere to echo. "You think one speech changes anything?" he asked. "You think this plane lands different because of you?" Martin looked around the cabin, not at faces, but at postures, at eyes no longer fixed on magazines, at hands unclenched without instruction. "I think it already has," he said. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing smooth skies ahead. The irony didn't go unnoticed. A few people almost smiled, then stopped themselves, unsure if it was allowed yet. The man stared at the seat in front of him, jaw working. When he spoke again, it was quieter than before, stripped of performance. "You don't know what it costs to admit you're wrong," he said. Martin nodded. "I do," he replied. "It costs the lie you were living in." The man didn't answer. He didn't argue. He didn't laugh. He sat with the weight of it, with the unfamiliar pressure of being seen not as powerful, but as exposed. And somewhere between the clouds and the silence, the cabin crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Not by altitude, not by landing, not by forgetting. The man broke the silence the way people do when they realize they are losing control of a room, by reaching for something larger than themselves. "You're enjoying this," he said, not looking at Martin now, but at the idea of him. "Standing there like you've won something. But let's be clear, none of this changes who makes the rules." Martin didn't stand. He remained seated, hands folded, posture relaxed, which somehow made the words heavier. "Rules," Martin said, "are often written by those who fear what fairness would cost them." The man turned sharply. "I built my life following rules. I earned what I have. I didn't get handouts. I didn't get sympathy." "And yet," Martin replied, "you are asking a system to protect you from sitting beside another human being." That stung. The man's face tightened, and for the first time since boarding, anger began to give way to something messier: embarrassment. He glanced around the cabin and saw it. Eyes that no longer flinched, faces no longer neutral. He straightened his jacket like armor. "You don't know me," he said. "You don't know what I've worked for." "You're right," Martin said gently, "but I know what you were willing to do to keep your comfort intact." A flight attendant passed again, slower this time, pausing just long enough to meet Martin's eyes and then the man's. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her presence alone signaled a shift. Authority was no longer unquestioned. The man leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You think this crowd decides anything?" he whispered. "When we land, everything goes back to normal." Martin looked past him, toward the cabin, toward the people who had been pretending this didn't concern them. "Normal," he said, "is simply injustice that has learned how to look familiar." A murmur followed. Someone nodded. Someone else exhaled sharply, like a confession escaping. The man shook his head. "You talk like a preacher." "I am one," Martin answered. "But this isn't a sermon. It's an observation." The plane cut through a thin layer of clouds, sunlight flashing briefly through the windows, bright enough to make people blink. For a moment, everything was exposed. Faces, expressions, the truth of who had stayed silent and who had begun to move. The man stared at his hands. They were shaking just slightly. "You want me to apologize?" he said again, quieter now. "I want you to understand," Martin replied. "Apologies without understanding are just performances." The words settled, slow and unavoidable. The man opened his mouth and closed it. He had reached the edge of the thing he always avoided. The moment where authority failed and only honesty remained. And for the first time since takeoff, he did not know which one to choose. The cabin waited with him. The man stared at his hands as if they belonged to someone else, flexing his fingers, releasing them, rehearsing a strength that no longer answered on command. Around him, the cabin had changed posture. People were no longer hiding behind objects, no longer pretending to sleep. Attention had become collective. "All right," the man said finally, voice rough. "You want understanding? Fine. Say what you're going to say, but don't pretend this makes you some kind of hero." Martin nodded once, accepting the terms without accepting the frame. He didn't stand. He didn't raise his voice. He simply turned slightly, aligning himself with the aisle, the rows, the witnesses. "Give me 1 minute," Martin said to the cabin, not asking permission, not demanding it either. 1 minute without interruption. No one objected. Even the man didn't laugh this time. The engines carried them forward, steady as breath. Martin inhaled. "At this height," he began, "we are closer to the sky than to the ground we argue over. And yet we bring the ground with us. Its fears, its habits, its old instructions about who may sit where, who may speak when, who must shrink so others may feel tall." He paused, letting the words find their seats. "This airplane does not ask the color of your hands before it lifts you. The air does not check your name before it carries you. Gravity does not discriminate when it holds us all in place. And yet here we are, inventing borders in a space that refuses them." A woman near the window wiped her eyes without looking away. A man further back leaned forward, elbows on knees as if drawn by a rope. "Racism," Martin continued, voice steady, "is not loud by nature. It survives through small permissions, through silence that agrees, through comfort that says, 'This is not my fight.' But every injustice ever endured began with a room full of witnesses deciding it was inconvenient to intervene." He turned his head slightly toward the man in the gray suit, not accusing, simply including him. "You are not the villain of a story," Martin said. "You are a man standing at a crossroads most people reach quietly and alone. The difference is that today, you reached it out loud." The man swallowed. His throat worked like he was trying to force down something solid. "We tell ourselves that dignity is a reward," Martin went on, "that it must be earned, purchased, defended by keeping others beneath us. But dignity is not a trophy. It is a condition. And the moment you deny it to another, you place your own on loan." The cabin was still. Even the clink of ice in cups seemed to wait. "I do not ask you to like me," Martin said. "I ask you to consider what it costs you to hate me for existing beside you." Silence followed. Not empty, but full. The kind that arrives when words have landed where they were meant to land. The minute ended, not with a signal, but with a shift. Something had been said that could not be folded away. Martin leaned back into his seat. The man stared straight ahead, eyes glossy, jaw tight. When he finally spoke, it was not to argue. It was to confess, though he did not yet know the word for it. For several seconds after Martin leaned back, nothing moved. Not the man, not the witnesses, not even the restless energy that usually filled a cabin once drinks carts began to roll. It was as if the plane itself had decided to hold its course without correction. The man in the gray suit cleared his throat once. Then again. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded unfamiliar to him, stripped of command, stripped of the confidence that had carried him through boardrooms and private clubs. "I didn't think," he said slowly, still staring forward, "that it sounded like that." No one rushed him. That was new. "It was just a thought," he continued. "Something you say without meaning it. Something you grew up hearing." He shook his head as if disappointed in the explanation, even as he offered it. "I didn't expect it to stop the room." Martin turned slightly toward him. Not fully, not confrontational, present. "That is how it usually survives," Martin said, "by never being examined long enough to feel its weight." The man exhaled, long and uneven. His shoulders dropped a fraction, as if he had been holding them in place for years. "You make it sound deliberate," he said. "It doesn't need to be," Martin replied. "Most harm is done by people who believe themselves ordinary." A murmur moved through the cabin. Not approval, not rejection. Recognition. The man finally turned his head. For the first time, he looked directly at Martin without the shield of mockery or anger. What looked back was not defiance, but something closer to confusion. "I don't see myself as a bad man," he said, almost to the room. "No one ever does," Martin answered gently. "That is why reflection is so dangerous." A woman across the aisle spoke before she could stop herself. "Then say you were wrong." The words hung there, fragile and bold. The man flinched as if struck. His instinct was to push back, to defend, to reassert control. But the room had changed. Silence no longer worked in his favor. Noise wouldn't either. He swallowed. "I was wrong," he said finally, the words uneven, unpolished. "I had no right to say what I said. No right to treat anyone like that." It wasn't eloquent. It wasn't redemptive. But it was real enough to make several people exhale at once. And then the argument began. "That doesn't erase it," someone said from the back. "It matters that he said it," another replied. "He wouldn't have if he hadn't been called out." "He still said it." Voices overlapped, careful but firm. The cabin split, not into sides but into questions. What counted? What changed? What stayed broken? Martin listened without intervening, letting the debate belong to the witnesses. He had never believed transformation could be forced, only invited. The man sat still, absorbing it all, no longer the center by command, but by consequence. When he spoke again, it was quieter. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said. I didn't know it looked like that from the outside." Martin nodded once. "That is the beginning," he said. "Not the end." Outside the window, the sky stretched on, wide, indifferent, unchanged. Inside the cabin, nothing would return to the way it had been at the gate, and everyone there knew it. The argument didn't explode, it spread. Quietly at first, then with a confidence that came from realizing no one was going to shut it down. A man near the back leaned into the aisle. "If nobody had said anything," he began, choosing each word like it might cost him later, "this would have passed as normal. That's the problem." "It is normal," someone else replied. "That's how people talk. We all know it." "We know it," the first man shot back, "but we don't usually hear it said out loud like that." A woman 2 rows ahead turned halfway in her seat. "So what?" she asked. "Are we supposed to pretend we're all saints now?" "He apologized." "And why did he apologize?" Another voice cut in. "Because he was cornered, or because he understood." The man in the gray suit stayed silent, eyes fixed on the tray table, fingers pressed together until they went pale. The room talked around him now, not to him. That was new too. Martin watched without directing, without rescuing. This was the part he never stole from people, the chance to wrestle with what they had seen. The stewardess paused beside the row again, longer this time. "I hear things like that every week," she said softly, surprising herself as much as anyone else. I've never seen someone answer it like that." No one laughed. No one dismissed her. A businessman shook his head. "That speech," he said almost reluctantly, "it didn't embarrass him. It embarrassed us, for letting it go on as long as it usually does." The woman with the wedding ring nodded. I wanted to disappear when it started, she admitted. Now I wish I hadn't. The plane cruised steadily, indifferent to the human recalibration happening inside it. Cups rattled softly in their holders. The seatbelt light stayed off. Life continued, but altered. The man finally looked up. His voice, when it came, was low and exposed. "You're all right," he said, "and that's the part that hurts the most." He turned to Martin, not defensive now, not challenging. "I spent years thinking decency was the same thing as order, that if I didn't break laws, I wasn't breaking people." Martin met his eyes. "Many confuse legality with morality," he said. "History depends on that confusion." No one argued with that. The debate softened, then thinned, as conversations do when they reach the edge of what can be said without changing something real. People leaned back, looked out windows, thought. The man exhaled slowly as if setting something down. "I don't know what comes next," he said. "You don't need to," Martin replied. "Only what doesn't." The cabin didn't applaud. It didn't need to. The witnesses had already done their part, and the flight continued, no longer just a journey through air, but through something most of them had avoided naming until now. The cabin had quieted, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everyone understood that whatever came next would not belong to the crowd. It would belong to the man who had started it. He sat very still for a long moment, hands flat on his thighs as if grounding himself in the fact that the seat was real, that the plane was real, that this was happening at 30,000 feet with nowhere to step away. When he spoke again, his voice was steadier. Not stronger, just steadier. "I need to say something without excuses," he said, and the words surprised him by coming out at all. "Because every explanation I've rehearsed sounds like another way to protect myself." No one interrupted. Even the restless sounds of the cabin seemed to thin. "I said what I said," he continued, eyes still forward, "because I thought I could, because I believed, honestly believed, that my comfort mattered more than your dignity." He paused, breath catching. "And because I've been rewarded for thinking that way my entire life." A woman near the aisle nodded once, not in approval, but in recognition. "I'm not asking to be forgiven," the man said. "I don't deserve that just because I'm uncomfortable now. I'm saying it because if I don't name it, I'll pretend it was just a misunderstanding." And it wasn't. He turned toward Martin at last. His voice dropped. "I'm sorry for trying to make you smaller so I could feel bigger." The words were plain. No flourish, no appeal. They landed with the weight of something that had been carried too long. Martin inclined his head. Not a bow, not acceptance, not refusal. Acknowledgement. "Thank you for saying it," he said. "What you do after saying it is where the work lives." The man nodded, absorbing that without protest. Around them, people shifted, not away this time, but back into themselves, as if each were measuring a private inventory of moments they had let pass unchallenged. The captain's voice returned over the intercom, announcing the beginning of descent. The plane tilted gently, the horizon lifting into view, a reminder that endings arrive whether we are ready or not. The man looked down at his hands again. They had stopped shaking. "I don't know if I would have heard any of this on the ground," he said quietly. "Altitude changes perspective," Martin replied, "but only if we're willing to look." Outside, the clouds thinned. Inside, something heavier had already come down. Pride, certainty, the illusion of innocence. The landing lights came on, and with them the understanding that when the wheels touched earth, the argument would not end. It would simply leave the cabin with them, carried into different lives, different choices. The man closed his eyes once, briefly, this time not in preparation, in resolve. The wheels touched the runway with a controlled odor, a brief violence followed by a long surrender, and the cabin exhaled as one body pretending it had only been a normal flight. Phones stayed down. No one rushed the aisles. The moment refused to dissolve on command. As the plane slowed, voices returned in fragments, whispers, half-sentences, unfinished thoughts. Each passenger testing whether the world outside would still recognize what had happened inside. The seatbelt light chimed. People stood, then sat back down again, unsure why their legs felt heavier than before. The man in the gray suit remained seated until his row was clear. He looked smaller now, not diminished by punishment, but by clarity. When he finally stood, he didn't reach for the overhead bin immediately. He turned to Martin, hesitated, then spoke so only those closest could hear. "I won't pretend this fixes me," he said, "but I won't pretend it didn't happen." Martin nodded. "That is more honest than most endings." They did not shake hands. They did not exchange names. This was not reconciliation. It was separation with memory intact. Down the aisle, witnesses argued in low tones as they gathered their coats. "He went too far," someone said. "No, he didn't go far enough," another replied. At least the man admitted it. "Only because he had nowhere to run." The stewardess paused beside row 14, eyes tired but steady. "Thank you," she said to Martin quietly. Not for the speech, for the permission. Outside, the jet bridge locked into place with a hollow thud. The door opened. The familiar smell of the terminal rushed in. Coffee, disinfectant, movement, ordinary life eager to reclaim its territory. Martin waited until most passengers had passed. Then he stood, gathered his folder, smoothed his coat, and stepped into the aisle without ceremony. No one applauded. No one needed to. Applause would have simplified something that refused to be simple. As he walked off the plane, a young man, barely more than a boy, looked up at him and said nothing, but his eyes carried the look of someone who had just learned what courage could sound like when it didn't shout. Behind them, the man in the gray suit lingered, watching the space Martin left behind, as if expecting it to close on its own. It didn't. The terminal swallowed them in different directions. The argument followed. Not as noise, but as a question each witness would answer later, alone, when comfort asked for silence again. And somewhere between the gate and the exit, it became clear that the flight's destination had never really mattered. What mattered was what each of them chose to carry after landing.